welcome to this
Hey, like the lamb, not the rat, like the lamb, not the rat.
episode of the Maza's Musings podcast. As we approach Jim Henson's 89th birthday, what would have been his 89th birthday, we will be talking all about this dynamic and innovative creator, and we'll be talking with Brian J. Jones, who's a biographer who wrote Jim Henson, the biography. And you may recognize that name, Brian J. Jones. He was on this podcast back in December, right around Christmas time, talking about another biography he did on Dr. Seuss. And specifically, we talked a lot about how the Grinch stole Christmas. That was a great conversation. So with this birthday coming up, I thought it would be appropriate to have him come back. And it was really great discussion. I always have a lot of fun talking with Brian. He's got another book that you'll hear about that's coming out next year. So we'll be sure to have him back on the podcast, at least at that point next year, to talk about that one. But of course, before we get to anything else, we always need a little humor in our lives, and Meghan is here to provide that. So let's laugh.
And now it's time for Meghan's
Cuckoo bananas.
Hi, Meghan.
Hi.
Do you have a joke for us?
Yes.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, actually, it's a riddle.
Oh, okay, a riddle. Let's hear it.
But it's a sort of funny riddle.
Okay.
What has a ring but no finger?
I don't know. What has a ring but no finger?
A telephone. Get it? Because like the ring's on the telephone, but it doesn't have a finger that goes through them?
What?
Like,
No, like a telephone rings. Like when somebody calls, the phone rings.
I know, but also there's another thing. What has a ring but no finger? But like those like ring thingies that twist around and when you pick it up so that you can hear who's calling.
Okay, I'll take your word for that.
But there's no finger that goes through.
Okay. All right. Okay, now you're being a cat. You're done with being a crab. Now you're being a cat. Okay. Say goodnight, kitty. All right, well, that was a riddle, but it was still a little humorous. So thank you, Meghan, for helping us think a little bit and then laugh a little bit. So before we get into anything else, we do have some very appropriate news related to Disney as it relates to this episode. And this information just dropped today as I'm recording this on Wednesday. Of course, our interview with Brian happened on Monday, but still all very timely. So let's get right to that with this week's Maza's Mickey Minute.
Donald, wake up! It's showtime! Don't forget the orchestra!
Ah, there you are. And just in time.
Mom says there's even more magical stuff now.
For those of you standing, please hold on to the handrails throughout our journey and stay clear of the doors.
Hang on to them hats and glasses, cause this here's the wildest ride in the wilderness. And here we go!
Well, it seems like fate that this got announced today. And this is from Disney Plus. This was a post on their social media. It says, it's time to play the music. It's time to light the lights. It's time to get things started as the Muppet Show returns for a triumphant event on Disney Plus in 2026 with special guest star Sabrina Carpenter. This brand new installment from the Muppet Studio and Point Grey Pictures will feature Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Gonzo, and the gang as they return to the Muppet Theater to put on a variety show filled with music, comedy, and plenty of chaos. Now, I do have a little bit more information that I was able to get here from some reporting. This is from Variety, and it says, on top of everything else, according to an individual with knowledge of the situation, the special could serve as a backdoor pilot that would help launch a new iteration of the iconic series. Veteran Muppet performers Bill Beretta, Dave Goelz, Eric Jacobson, Peter Linz, David Rudman, and Matt Vogel will perform the majority of the Muppet characters in the special, supported by a team of additional performers. Now, later on, it says that Albertina Rizzo will serve as the writer and executive producer, and among others, Alex Timbers will direct the episode. Sabrina Carpenter serves as executive producer on this variety show, and Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg, James Weaver, and Alex McCaddy are also executive producers via Grey Point Pictures, along with David Lightbody, Lee Slaughter, Michael Steinbeck from the Muppet Studio. Matt Vogel and Eric Jacobson are also executive producers. Lots of people have their hands in this, it seems. So, who knows where this will actually lead, but it does appear that there was some fire to the smoke, that there was a Muppet show type thing coming, and that Seth Rogen was involved. We had heard rumors about this. Now, of course, we've heard rumors about relaunches of the Muppet Show forever, but this one, there's an actual announcement. Something is happening. Whether this is a one-off that is somehow related to Rock and Roller Coaster, that may be. It may also be, as Variety reported, part of something bigger. So we'll just have to see. I've got my fingers crossed. I know that Brian mentions in this episode that he's not sure that the Muppet Show would be able to survive in the current climate, simply because people don't have the patience for it. We'll get more into that, but I've always stood firm that if you put the Muppet Show on TV now, it would be one of the top rated shows. So we'll see which one is right. But I gotta say, I'm pretty excited, and I may be getting ahead of myself, but I'm pretty hopeful that this will lead to more Muppet projects. Well, with the potential of a return of the Muppet Show, of course, I'm thinking about other things that might have a return, and that includes my return to Walt Disney World. Now, I don't know exactly when that will be, but I do know that when it happens, I'll be using We Do Travel Right. Well, and that's because We Do Travel Right provides that one-on-one service of an agent, but that agent has the power of a team behind them. So you're getting that personalized service, but with a whole lot of power behind it. So they'll help you get all those hard-to-get dining reservations, those park tickets, your hotel reservations. They'll help you learn how to navigate things like the app and how to navigate the parks. And they'll also work with you to find out what's going to be the best fit for you and your family, whether it's what experiences you want or what your budget is, whatever. And speaking of budget, the best part about all of these services is they're free. Yeah, We Do Travel Right doesn't charge you anything extra. That's because Disney or Universal or cruise lines or all-inclusives, they all build the use of an agent into their pricing anyway. So you're paying for the agent whether you use one or not. So doesn't it just make sense to use an agent? So if you are ready to find out more, you can go to wedotravelright.com/Maza. That's wedotravelright.com/MAZA. And they'll help you get your next magical vacation started today.
Well, I can't do any more damage around this popsicle stand.
So long, partner.
See you real soon.
Well, now appropriately, we are going to go right into our main topic with Brian J. Jones talking about Jim Henson. I am here with Brian J. Jones, who is author and biographer. He's written a number of books, including one on Jim Henson. It's Jim Henson, the biography. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Next week would have been the 89th birthday of Jim Henson. So I thought that this was a great opportunity to talk with you about your book and some of the takeaways that not giving away the whole book obviously, but giving us some of the impressions and takeaways from as you were researching this book and putting it together. And I just really enjoyed your insight when we did our Dr. Seuss episode, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So before we get into Jim Henson, I'd love to give you the opportunity to reintroduce yourself to those who listened to that podcast in December, and introduce yourself to any new listeners that we have.
Sure. And Chris, great to be back with you again. You and I were talking offline. We were trying to remember when we did this, and it doesn't seem that long ago, actually. It's hard to believe it was Christmas last year. My name is Brian J. Jones. I am a writer and a biographer, and I basically own your childhood. I've written biographies of Jim Henson, George Lucas, Dr. Seuss, Washington Irving, if you're old enough to appreciate that one. And I'm presently working on a different kind of a biography of a different American icon. I'm still calling it a biography, but it's a biography of the U.S. Capitol building. So that'll be out next June. I'm still in the final edits on it, but I'm very excited and a little nervous about that one. But I love the subjects I write about. I mean, I write about sort of iconic figures, iconic American creatives. It's really, really fun place to be. I love my job. I love doing the research on it. And like I said, I love to talk about my subject. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks.
Now, it's interesting that you're doing something on buildings for your next book, but approaching it as a biography. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. Partly it's because I was a congressional staffer for almost 10 years. I worked in the U.S. Capitol building. And January 6th made me very mad. And I remember standing up in the chair in my office at my desk and screaming at the television as people were streaming onto the floor of the Senate, yelling things like, "You have no right! You have no right to be there! You have no right to do that!" And I just felt so awful all around, and I just felt awful for that building. Which, if you've had the privilege of working in it, and you get to, and you get to sit on those, the floor of the House or the Senate, which is basically the same as they've been since 1859. It's just a real privilege. And one of the things I wanted to do, again, sort of to sort of let the Capitol know how much I appreciated it, was I wanted to write sort of a history of it, which I call a biography because it sort of is my mindset on this. And I think the book will probably have the word biography in it somewhere. But it was really fascinating to look into. I did not know so much of it. And this is not an architecture book. It's about the people involved in the design and the construction of the Capitol building. And almost every chapter you've got, two people sort of going at it. Every chapter sort of got conflict. A lot of times it's the architect who designed it versus the superintendent who's building it. And the superintendents want to get their fingerprints on that building and are trying to, put their own mark on the architect, and the architect's trying to tell them to stop doing that and pull rank on them. And, people run tattling to presidents of the United States to tell on them. And anyway, every chapter was something new and interesting to me. And like I said, it's not going to be a book about architecture. I use about 5 architectural terms, so you won't have to have a dictionary of architectural terms next to you. It'll just be about the people and the enslaved people who built the building and have just really incredible stories that I don't think I'm telling them for the first time, but I think it's going to be the first time you'll see them all kind of in one place. So I'm a little nervous. It's a little bit out of my lane, history as opposed to biography. But again, my mindset for it the entire time was I'm going to treat this building like a biography, and the Capitol is my main character. And everything that happens has to relate to how it impacted that building as the main character, and the people that came into it that affected its life. And so I treated it that way, and it was a lot of fun. So I hope everyone enjoys it when it comes out next, like I said, next June 2nd. So stay tuned.
I'll look forward to that, and we'll have to have you back on to talk a little bit more about that once we get closer to that.
Well, that would be great. That would be great. Like I said, I'm in the last editing, the last third of it right now with my editor this week. So.
Now, obviously, the main character, so to speak, of this book that we're talking about today was Jim Henson, and I'm really curious about your approach to the subject matter. And I know that you had a lot of cooperation from the Henson family. So just talk a little bit about your approach and how working with them and kind of how you dove into this topic about this man whose life was, ultimately way too short. But he managed to pack a lot in that in that 50, what was it, 56 years, 53 years.
Yeah, when I started the book, I was younger than Jim, and I am now 6 years older, 5 years older than Jim. It's very strange feeling to know that I've outlived him, and realizing just how short a time that was that he was around. Really humbling. So Jim Henson was a subject that when I started poking around it, I couldn't believe no one had actually done it or was doing it. As I found out later, it seemed like someone probably approached the Hensons about every week about doing it. So I feel very fortunate that I'm the one who was lucky enough to get the project. I think I got it. I think one of the things that helped me was that I love doing research. And at the time, I was actually living in Maryland, the next county over from where Jim Henson grew up. So his neighborhood was sort of my neighborhood. And he grew up in Washington, D.C. and did a lot of his first work in Washington, D.C. So when you live in Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress is also your local library. So when I was pitching the Hensons on why I needed to be the guy to do this, I went down to the Library of Congress and I pulled every story I could find on him from all the local newspapers. So it wasn't just the Washington Post and the Washington Times. It was these little Virginia newspapers and Northern Virginia newspapers and local Maryland newspapers that were all raving about this genius, this high school kid who was performing puppets on a local television show. And I did some research on the history of puppetry and the history of television and the history of puppetry on television. And I wrote a chapter on it that's sort of intact even now in the book, just sort of on how Jim ends up doing Sam and Friends, which was his first show. He did, again, he was in high school when he built the puppets and was a freshman at the University of Maryland, and he's got his own TV show and he's winning an Emmy and he's working all day on this. So I wrote that chapter based on a lot of the research I'd done and sent that to the Hensons and said, this is the way I would do this. Because I don't want to be the voice telling the story. I want, as much as possible, Jim's voice to be the one telling the story. And I think when they saw that chapter and how serious I was going to take it and how serious I am about research and trying to get Jim's voice in there as much as possible, that sort of knocked the door open for me. At one point, Lisa Henson had said to me something like, if we tell you no, are you just going to go out and write this anyway? And I said, I don't think I can, because Jim's not a guy like George Lucas. George Lucas, that cat has been talking on the record since he was like 21 years old. And long, lengthy interviews. And Jim never really did that. So if you were going to try to write something without their help, there's not a lot out of there laying around that you can find. Lucas, I did not have Lucas's participation, but a lot of times people come up to me and they can't believe that, because his voice comes out very strong in that book. Because again, he's been talking on the record forever. Jim never really did. Even during his lifetime, he did not like to sit for long interviews. So what I told Lisa is, if I don't think I could do it the way I want to without your participation, because you have, the warehouse with the Ark of the Covenant in it. You have the Jim Henson archives. You have all of his papers and, his business papers, things like that. They don't belong to a library or anything like that. They're not at the University of Connecticut with their big puppetry program, or the University of Maryland. They're privately held. And so, the best way to do it is to have access to those archives. And so that's when I told Lisa, I just, if you tell me no, don't worry, I'm not going to go out there and try to write it, because I couldn't do it the way I wanted to without his voice in it. And so, like I said, fortunately, when I sent them that sample chapter and they sort of saw the way I was putting it together, they gave me that access, and that was the game changer. And also the other game changer you get with that is they do hand you the keys to the kingdom, and that if you'd say, God, it would be really helpful to have Frank Oz, and they're like, here is Frank Oz's phone number and email, and we will tell him you're coming. And they have a great archivist there in Karen Falk, who's still there, just a brilliant archivist, knows where everything is, and went above and beyond, lugged boxes of paper for me. And, she's just a fantastic archivist and researcher. And she knows a lot about what's going on too. She just, she's not necessarily a writer in that regard. So she knew where a lot of the material was and could have really good conversations with me about why do you think, which is sometimes a dangerous place to go when you're a biographer. You don't always want to ask why, how was someone thinking? But Karen was really good about, we talking about Jim. Why do you think he did it this way? Why would he save this and not that? So that was a really helpful part of the experience too. So it was just, having those archives was critical. The Hensons were great about it. The book is not an authorized biography in the sense that authorized tends to mean that if there's something in it that they don't like, they can change it. And the Hensons, to their credit, did not ask for that. They asked that they be permitted to read the early draft of it, and that any feedback they gave me, I would take seriously. And I would be stupid not to ever take any feedback they gave to me seriously. I gave them actually every draft of the book as it went along. And that was hugely helpful. And it's can be tough sometimes because there at that time there were 5 children and the widow, and everybody's got an angle, everybody's got an agenda. And an agenda is not a loaded word. It just means, Cheryl was great about Sesame Street, and Lisa was great on the business side of it, and Brian was great on the sort of crazy performance side of things, and Heather was great at the very artistic, elegant side of things, and John was more about Jim's spiritual side. So they all brought something to the table, and they all sort of like could sometimes, be very protective of that and the way I would handle that and talk about that. But again, to their credit, they, if they had something to say, they would say it. And 8 times out of 10, I would say, oh, you know what? Thanks for that. Let me take care of that. Sometimes I would say, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's an interesting dynamic because Lisa's the oldest kid. And when Lisa finally said, I am okay with the book, that was kind of it. It was kind of all the input stopped at that point. Lisa, as the oldest, sort of had the last word on that. So they were a really interesting family, get to know, very talented, really funny, as you can probably imagine. Jane, his widow, who's passed right before the book came out, even incredibly funny, scared the crap out of me. She's a very powerful presence. You can see why Jim Henson would have chosen her to be his first performing partner. She's a brilliant performer, very funny, but very serious about her work, very serious about the business. And despite the differences she and Jim had, a lot of their time together, very serious about Jim and very serious about the work. So it was a privilege to get to sort of operate and, peer in the windows of that building for as long as I did. And it's, I always say the first line of my obituary will probably be, Jim Henson biographer Brian J. Jones ... And I'm actually so okay with that. So
now you mentioned throughout this, you mentioned Sam and Friends, which was, of course, his first real public work, and real dive into the into public entertainment. It was one of the first times that we got a glimpse at what would eventually become Kermit the Frog. But what caused that dive in? Like, what made that all happen for him? Because I'd imagine that there are some things that really have to come together perfectly to, take an idea like a puppet show for TV, even on a smaller scale, and have someone say, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for Jim was a crazy disregard for the rules, a crazy talent for being able to solve problems with the solution sort of hidden in plain sight, raw talent, ambition, and some of it's being in the right place at the right time. I mean, he was in a big enough TV market in Washington, D.C., for example. He's not in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No offense to people in Tulsa. I grew up in Damascus, or lived in Damascus, Maryland, which was a very small town. So, but he was in, at that time, a place where it was over-the-air television. Washington, D.C. had a lot of channels. They had 5, which was a lot at that time. But Jim Henson was not one of these guys who wanted to be a puppeteer. He's not Steven Spielberg. As I always say, Spielberg from the age of 8, was crashing his trains together in slow motion. And, and everybody's like, that Steven wants to be a movie director. And I think Steven would agree. Jim didn't want to be a puppeteer. As he always said, he never really played with puppets, nothing like that. He watched Cuckoo, and Ollie, but so did Orson Welles. And Orson Welles didn't become a great puppeteer. So people watched Cuckoo, and Ollie because it was a show everybody watched. It was one of the most popular shows on TV. That was sort of his exposure to puppetry. What Jim wanted to do was be on TV. No matter what it took. He loved television. Jim was always a gadget freak and loved TV when it came out. He talked about how he badgered his parents into buying one so he could just watch it. And he watched everything. This was about 1949 when he would have been 13 years old, probably, when he got TV. And I always try to compare it to the early days of cable. Like when we all had cable, when the box was still on the long cord attached to the TV. You might even be old enough for this, Chris, but when the box was still attached to a cable, literally to the table to attach to the TV, and you had this box with these buttons on it, and we would just shotgun through all those channels, like just trying to see what's like KTLA from Los Angeles and WGN from Chicago, just like all these channels, like all these options, all these weird opportunities, public access. What's going on in these where anybody can make a TV show. And that was sort of the early days of TV for Jim. Whatever was on, he would watch it. It was early days of cable. Whatever was on, we watched it. And he was just fascinated by the idea that what you were seeing on television could be going on at that moment live someplace else. So just was fascinated by TV, wanted to be in TV. I think he really thought he was going to be a behind the scenes guy. He loved building things and painting, and he really wanted to be in set design. But when he was in high school, there was a notice in the Washington Post that said, hey, there's a show here on the local CBS affiliate that they're looking for young people to perform puppets. I think they were probably looking for little kids, but Jim didn't care. He was I think, a senior in high school. And so if that's what it was going to take to get into television, then Jim was going to go down and present himself as a puppeteer. So in the span of about 2 weeks, he checked 2 books out of his high school library. It's amazing that a high school library had, Sergei Obraztsov's book, My Life, in puppetry, like a biography or a memoir by a Russian puppeteer. And then Marjorie Batchelder's book on how to build and perform puppets in the puppet theater, and gave himself sort of a crash course in puppetry and built these puppets. And Jim could sew like crazy. He was very handy. His grandmother Dear was this very artistic, craftsy, woman, and just taught him how to sew and things. So Jim could make all these things himself. And so he made these, 2 very primitive puppets and went down to the CBS station and said, I'm a puppeteer. And he got that job. And that was really kind of all Jim wanted out of puppets at that time, was it just got him in the room. And, Don Draper's like, get me in the room. Jim just wanted to be in the room. And it turned out that he was just so good at it that people just kept bringing him into other rooms. So the show he was doing on CBS went under very quickly, partly because they were using underage employees. But Jim ends up getting hired immediately at WRC, the local NBC station. And that's where he sort of starts to thrive and shine. He does a lot of sort of local variety shows, but he's building puppets. And what he does at that time is he tends to have them lip sync to records. Jim doesn't do voices. And they're just kind of sidekicks in all these local shows. But they end up giving him his own show that he develops called Sam and Friends. And I think what made Jim such a innovative performer of puppetry on television, and this sounds so weird when I explain it to people nowadays, because it's the way we've grown up with puppets on television that people have for, 60 years now, basically. But like Cuckoo, Fran, and Ollie was the puppets in this space, but they put a curtain in front of them and had them in a puppet theater. They filmed the puppet theater. Nobody really thought to remove that puppet theater and say, this square is the puppet theater. This is my space that the puppet exists in. Jim inherently understood that on television, the 4 sides of the screen were your puppet theater. When that happens, you can throw out the constructed puppet theater with the curtain and just use the entire screen. Stay out of sight, but use it all. And what that does is that opens the entire area up. You don't just come in this way. You don't just come in this way, or you can come in from the bottom. You come in from the top. You can pull back. You can rush the camera. That gives your puppets, even puppets that don't have eyes that move or even mouths that move, this life that they don't just have in that little confined space of a puppet theater. Now, Jim, because he was on television, tended to build puppets that looked great on TV. They had movable mouths and they had eyes that focused. Jim figured out that if you took the eyes of a puppet and just very slightly turned them in, it gave their eyes focus. So you actually cross them just slightly, and that focuses their eyes. If you don't do that, they kind of look almost like they're wandering, looking out in the opposite directions. So again, that's a solution hidden in plain sight, is use all four sides of the TV screen. To us, that seems like a no-brainer because we grew up on Sesame Street and the Muppets, and like we're used to not seeing the puppet theater. We're used to just seeing them interacting in the space on the TV screen, but nobody had really figured that out before. And the other thing that Jim figured out is that if what you're seeing on the TV screen here is what matters, then you need to be sure you know what that looks like. So the solution for him was to just put a TV monitor on the floor right in front of him. So he's seeing exactly what the audience sees at any time. It's not a special feed. He's just seeing what the audience sees. Now, part of the issue with that is it's reversed because you're facing the screen, which is you. So if you want the pup to go this way on screen, you've actually got to move this way on the floor. I don't think my brain would ever do it. Jerry Joel said something like, yeah, Jim told me it was like riding a bike. And Jerry Joel's like, it is not like riding a bike. Like it's got to be so hard to get your brain to figure that out. But that's still the Muppet style of performing today. They still watch themselves in that TV monitor. Everybody's got the monitor to watch that performance. You know, not just that your head's not in it, but watching that performance so you can adjust it in real time. There's really no other kind of performer that can do that. Rock musicians, they don't see themselves on TV. They're not watching their own performance while they're singing. An actor they're not watching their performance on screen while they're doing it. Only in the Muppet style of performing do you watch your performance and can adjust it in real time. So that's two huge innovations in puppetry right there that Jim developed from day one as a Muppet performer. Still defines the look and the feel and the performing style of the Muppets today. So that's a long way of explaining that a lot of things went right. And he got into WRC at a time when they were looking for people to come and perform. He starts doing these small shows and he's in a big market and starts to get noticed, but he's also just so good. So good. There's a quote from one of the producers who says the kid's absolutely a genius. They were already throwing around the word genius when Jim was 19. So they give him his own television show, which is Sam and Friends. And it doesn't happen right away. That was, I don't want to call it myth busting, but it used to be, they were like, and then Jim got the spot right before the Tonight Show. Like that actually took him a couple years to get, but regardless, he had the spot right after the news in Washington, DC. He had 2 shows a day, so he had 2 5-minute spots twice a day and hustled, just did the work and got a following and just, won an Emmy with it. And was just sort of the local kid and the local program that everybody loved. So being in that market was really fortunate for him. A lot of people were watching him. And eventually, as he ended up being the lead into, he was right after the 10 o'clock news. And the next show after that, sort of like nowadays, was The Tonight Show. Steve Allen, the host of The Tonight Show, somebody told him, you've got to see what they've got on TV right before you down in Washington, D.C. This is nuts. And so Steve Allen puts Jim and Jane on The Tonight Show. Again, a lot of things had to happen and a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is just good fortune. But most of it is actually just talent and hustle and innovation more than anything else.
It's funny, as we're talking, I'm just thinking about, on top of everything else, the idea of that kind of local programming and that opportunity just doesn't exist today, that it the way that it did, back when Jim.
Yeah, again, the closest I can come to it is those early days of public access, on early days of cable, where kind of anybody could have a TV show. But yeah, you don't have that now. Everything's sort of locked up, behind streamer services and things.
Now you talked a lot about the mechanics of the puppetry and how he figured out ways to make the puppets move in different ways and how to use the space differently. But one thing that I have always thought was fascinating was the way that Jim and those around him would treat the Muppets like they were actors. Like they didn't treat them like they were puppets. They were characters. They were people with personalities, and I think that that's something that I think also might set him apart from other people who had been doing puppetry or some other kind of those mediums where it's not just human actors. Oh, I think I lost your audio here.
Sorry. I hit my cough button and it locked up. You have to be careful with Jim and preciousness of puppets, because all 5 kids told me that Jim was not precious with puppets. When he was done with them and they were starting to get old, he would throw them in the toy box. And would, just lay them down on the table. And then, Carol Spinney tells a story about how he saw Jim just sort of almost drop Ernie on the floor once. And Carol went over and scooped him up and was like, "Oh, are you okay?" And Jim's like, "Do you really talk to the puppets like that?" But Jim knew that character was king, that character is what really mattered. And he also knew that what really mattered was that Muppet performer, and that Muppet performing was hard and took work. And this is jumping around a little bit, but that was one of the real sticking points Jim had with the deals to sell his company to Disney. Was Disney was concentrating on the toy box. They wanted the puppets, and Jim said, you don't get Gonzo unless you take Dave Goelz with you. You have to take those puppeteers. You have to take care of the puppeteers. You can't just put the puppet on the arm of a 21-year-old and have them walk around at Disney World. You have to train people on how to do this. So Jim took the performance very seriously, and would talk about how they're great actors. I mean, I don't think Jim would have ever said Kermit's a great actor. He would have said he was a great actor. Frank Oz always talked about how he didn't say Piggy couldn't sing. He said he couldn't sing. That he would say that any truck driver could sing better than he could. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Jim did treat the puppets like great actors, but more than anything, he treated them like great characters. Because to him and to writers like Jerry Joel, character was always what mattered the most. That's why if you watch that first season of the Muppet Show, when Jerry Joel's not yet the head writer, versus the second season when Jerry's the head writer, Jerry really gets those relationships and throws out a lot of those, they're funny, but like the dance routine where they're just zinging out one-liners. Jerry's like, get rid of that. We don't have time for jokes. We're going to talk about the interactions between the characters. So Jerry really got that. And Jim knew that's what mattered. Frank Oz knew that was what mattered. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that's always made the Muppets so great. And Bert Hillstrom doing Cuckoo, Fran and Ollie, like he sort of got that too. He had fully developed characters. He had one that didn't move its mouth or its eyes, but had fully developed characters. And when one of them blew their nose on a curtain, everybody sent them tissues, for all of us. So I think even from that lesson, Jim knew that characters were what really mattered. So I think that's what makes the Muppets so funny, and what makes the Muppets so feel so real to us is they're not just puppets. They're not just funny, but they're characters. They are like real people to us, because again, they really appreciated that character was what mattered the most.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, like that first season of the Muppet Show, and I did go back and watch some of it. Some of it's a little rough, it really didn't hit its stride right off the bat.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that season 2 is really where it kind of hit the stride with, more of a development of the interactions between characters as opposed to gags, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, season 1's still great. It's still funny, but it's laugh in for puppets. It's not developing those relationships. You've got a lot of classic bits come out of that first season, but the really good stuff starts when they start to, again, when Jerry Joel gets his hands on it, and they really start to understand that the relationship between those characters is what makes it funny and what makes you care. If people, if things start going crazy and Kermit loses his temper, we're upset for Kermit, and then if he starts yelling at people, then we're like, oh no, Kermit, don't yell at people. So we absolutely invest in those characters once they, once they start becoming characters, we're absolutely invested in that.
Now, obviously, the Sesame Street angle was something that is really synonymous with Jim Henson, and he had a real impact on that, but he wasn't always sold that was where he wanted to go with that. What was the turning point? I understand, like, he didn't want to be pigeonholed as as someone who made kids entertainment. Yeah. But what was the turning point? What actually convinced him that this was the right move?
Yeah. So first, the 1960s is one of my very favorite parts of Jim's career, because he's got so many balls in the air and he's doing so many different things, and puppetry and the Muppets is really only one of the many things he's doing. He's doing short films, some that don't have any puppets in them at all. He's doing experimental he has this thing called The Cube, which is like this half-hour Twilight Zone episode. Again, no puppets at all. He's trying to develop a sort of, when I say adult, I don't mean dirty. I mean, it was like for grown-ups, like a themed adult nightclub where people could go to dance, and they would project, the equivalent of music videos on the walls and on video screens on the floor. And the biggest problem is the technology didn't really exist to do all that. But he's just really exploring and doing a lot of really innovative, cool stuff, again, of which the Muppets are a part. But if you would have asked him at that time, he would have told you about all the other things he's doing. He's not really locked in yet. Now, when you're reading that chapter in the book, you know that the exclamation point at the end of this sentence is going to be Sesame Street. And I deliberately ended the chapter with those two words. And that kind of defined his direction at that point. Because again, before that, Jim did an awful lot of things. And the thing that he's really interested in, apart from puppets, is that technology. And that comes back in later on with things like Dark Crystal. But once he goes to Sesame Street, he's kind of all in. And he does say, this is gonna define me. I don't want to be defined as just a children's performer. I want to be a family performer, which he was very successful at making that case. But I think the way they got him for Sesame Street was a number of things. First of all, this was around the time that Neil Minow had called television the vast wasteland. And Jim loved television. And I think something that kind of hurt his feelings. Jim really wanted TV to matter. And he's writing pieces for TV Guide and things like that, talking about television and why television matters and how parents can watch TV responsibly with their children. So Jim really wants TV to matter. So I think that the idea of Sesame Street was very appealing to him. Television that mattered. Television, unlike prior shows for kids like Romper Room, it was like television for TV that had a pedagogy. It had been developed with educators and what Jim would have called lovingly the eggheads. I think he kind of loved, he was the state college guy. He was like the University of Maryland guy. And you had all these Harvard and Yale educated people. And here he's the state educated guy, kind of like, you guys are taking yourselves way too seriously. But I think that really appealed to him, that it was educational TV that had real education behind it. And he was so pivotal in the development of that. They said they knew they wanted puppets on Sesame Street, and there were big conversations about whether the puppets and the humans should interact. When they initially did it, they had the Muppet sequences sort of locked away in their own little world and didn't have them on the street. I'll get to that in a second. But he was so important to the project that John Stone, who's sort of one of the grand old creators of Sesame Street, said, Jim Henson's your guy on this. And if you can't get him, then you need to throw out the idea of having puppets on Sesame Street at all. That's how important Jim was to this project. They weren't just going to let any old puppeteer do this. They knew that Jim was the guy they wanted. And Joan Gantz Cooney, who loved his Wilkins commercials, where you have two Muppets doing absolutely terrible things to each other, she knew that was the guy she wanted too. She wanted somebody who was funny and could deliver a message. And Sesame Street was sort of, one of their conceits was they were doing advertising. They were sponsored by the letter M and the number 4. And so they were going to do these little short spots. So they wanted somebody who kind of had an advertising feel to it as well. And so Jim was the guy. He was a quick cut editing kind of guy. You watch something like The Cube, which is his 1965 experimental film. It's kind of like Hard Day's Night. It's all these really quick cuts to it. And the music, the percussive beat of the drum is sort of keeping the action going. So there's a lot of reasons Jim was the right guy. Definitely the right guy. But that still wasn't going to be enough. I think for him, what really got him is they said, TV's going to matter. This is TV developed with a pedagogy. You're our guy. You're very funny. You're an awesome performer. But also, we're going to let you do more than just Muppets. So what I think a lot of people don't realize is a lot of those films, the interstitials, the films, the inserts, that we all loved, and I think they still show a lot of them today, are Jim Henson films. The Baker films, for example. We always call them the Baker films. He called them things like numerosity, where they count off the number 4, and it always ends with a baker standing at the top of the stairs saying 10 chocolate cakes, and then it's Jim's voice, but it's not Jim who's the baker, and then falling down the stairs with him. So those are all films that Jim writes and directs. He does The King of 8, that stop motion film. He writes and directs that. So a lot of those really innovative short films you're seeing. There's one on body parts with boys playing in the sandbox. One of those boys is actually his son, Brian Henson. So I think letting him do those little short films was really important. And I think that's one of the ways they got him. I think that's one of the ways they really sweetened that offer was, yeah, you can do the Muppets, but you can also do a lot of these little short films. And Jim turned in most of those films without making a single profit on them. He filmed them at cost and gave them to them. And that's how important they were to him. He just wanted them in the show. Now, getting back to the point about they wanted the Muppets on Sesame Street, but there was a lot of conversation about whether they should be, somebody said, one of the eggheads probably, you have to distinguish between them. You don't want kids losing their touch on reality. The Muppets are in their own thing and the humans are in their own world. What they found when they did the first sort of test pilots for that is when the Muppets were on screen, all the kids sat up and watched and paid attention. And when they were not there, the kids tuned out, no matter how awesome Gordon and Bob and Maria are, Susan. So they realized they had a problem. They had to get Muppets on the street. And that's where Big Bird and Oscar came from. They were deliberately put in there to be the Muppet presence on the street. Now, at that point, Jim had a problem because he said, I can't do this many shows. I can't be here every day doing this. I've got other stuff to do. So that's where Carol Spinney comes in and plays both those parts. And it did it, he was the Iron Man, did it for a long time. But that was sort of how the Muppets got onto Sesame Street. And then, the wall sort of came down. You see Ernie and Bert in their apartment and, it's a free for all at that point. So because they knew it didn't matter. Kids knew the difference. Kids understood those were Muppets and that there was something about them that was fantastic and not real, but still real as they interacted with the adults. So that was how you got the Muppets on Sesame Street. But it was a really important project to Jim, but he was, as you said, a little nervous about being pigeonholed as a children's performer.
Well, obviously he broke out of that a little bit. He did things like the Dark Crystal, like Labyrinth, even, like the Muppet movie is not, it's not kids programming.
Yeah.
And
well, even the Muppet Show. I mean, that was his selling point on the Muppet Show the entire time was this is family entertainment. I mean, Jim knew that the Muppets could hold their own on television for half an hour. He had proposals for the Muppet Show in the archives going back to 1964 or something. So tried for a long time to get that on there, but that became the family. That was the gateway drug at that point to getting the Muppets to explode everywhere else.
So, and when he did these other things that were not Muppet related projects, like the Dark Crystal, like Labyrinth, they've kind of adapted some cult followings, but they weren't like really embraced the same way. Do you think that people were kind of like, well, this isn't what I expect from Jim Henson?
So I told Lisa Henson, Sinatra told me not to name drop. I told Lisa Henson that I was part of his problem because I saw Dark Crystal. I think I was 12 maybe when it came out, maybe a little bit older than that. And I was kind of part of the problem. I came out of the Dark Crystal going, that's not what I expected out of Jim Henson. I was part of the problem. I was pigeonholing him. I didn't want to let him grow up. And I think that was a problem. I think a lot of us did that to him. It's kind of heartbreaking that we're all complicit in it in a way. Because the beauty of having hindsight now, like for example, when I talk about Jim Henson on college campuses and I put Labyrinth up on the wall, the place explodes. They love it. They grew up with it. It's one of their all-time favorites. They watch it constantly. I didn't grow up with it. I remember when it came out. And it was we were baffled by it a little bit. Especially with Labyrinth, we were like, is this music video? Is this supposed to be scary? Is it supposed to be funny? We didn't know how to read it. Kids, high school, college students, kids today they've got a little bit more of a sophisticated media palette because they get so much different media. They kind of know how to read it when they see it. We didn't really know how to do it. Jim was right about stuff like the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, but at the wrong time. It's like the line in Back to the Future where Marty's like, your kids are going to love this. That's kind of what happened with Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Our kids loved it. At the time, we were a little bit baffled by it. And again, I'm older than you are, so maybe you were like, you've been a fan since day one. I just remember Lisa Henson's very funny because I told her something about when I was, discussing the project with her. And I said, hey, and I saw Labyrinth in the theater. And she goes, oh, so that was you. I mean, she's very funny about it. They knew that like it didn't land the way Jim wanted it to land. But nowadays it's I wouldn't even just call it a cult classic. It's a classic. People love that movie. Dark Crystal, Labyrinth. I put them on the wall. The room goes crazy for him. Jim's right about him but at the wrong time. We were really not ready to let him grow up. God dang us. We were really trying to hold him back. And like, where are and the poor guy, when I was going through the press clippings for Dark Crystal, every interview starts with, "Where are the Muppets?" The poor guy could not get into talking about the innovation and the puppetry and the performances. And so he had to explain that this was something different than the Muppets were. We just were not ready for it. We were not ready for him to grow up and move on.
Now, I know that you say as a biographer you don't want to speculate too much on what somebody thought, but was there any reflection from anybody you talked to and in your research? Was there frustration on his part that this didn't land the way that he hoped it would?
Yes, Labyrinth was the one that kind of broke his heart in a way, because as I think Jerry Joel even says, everything you see on screen looks exactly the way he wanted it to look. It was a project really, really close to his own heart. You can say what you want about whether there's story issues or things like that. Jim really loved the look of that film. He loved Bowie. He loved the performance. He loved the tech that they had put into it. Only Jim, this is in the early days of CGI, only Jim would blow his CGI load on the opening credits, like the owl flying over the opening credits. Like, that's all CGI and that's it. He was so excited to use that tech. So there's a lot going on in Labyrinth that is Jim using it all, doing everything he wants to do. So I think that one, he really sort of felt he'd left it on the field and was heartbroken when it didn't land the way he wanted it to. When Dark Crystal did okay. Without Dark Crystal making money, you don't get Labyrinth. But that was one where he was kind of like the line in the Ed Wood movie where he's like, "Oh, worst movie you ever saw? Well, my next one will be better." He was kind of that way with Dark Crystal. He was like, don't worry, the next one's going to be better. And he and Brian Froud were having a conversation like, the problem is there were no people in it, which I think some people would be like, the problem with Dark Crystal is not that there were no human beings in it. But he was like, that one, he was still sort of like willing to laugh it off. Labyrinth, I think, really, really broke his heart. I don't think that that's the reason he decided to sell his company to Disney. That was kind of a common narrative people say, is like, Labyrinth didn't do well, he decided to hang up. I think that was what sent him back to television was Labyrinth. He had sort of like didn't go where he was planning to go on the movie screen, so he went back to doing television, and that's when he does like the fairy tale theater, or is that what it's called? Also, I've lost the name of it. Jim Henson Presents, the Jim Henson Hour, where he does the sort of the Lonesome Giant and a lot of those really beautiful fairy tale stories. I think that sends him back to television. I think what prompts him to want to sell his company is the fact that once he gets back to television, even there, he's still not quite getting it right. I think he understood that he was spreading himself very thin at that point, and he wanted to kind of take the business side of the Jim Henson Company off of his back so he could concentrate on being Jim Henson in the Jim Henson Company. So I think the sort of misfire with the Jim Henson Hour is what prompts him to sell to Disney, not Labyrinth. A lot of people are like, "Oh, after Labyrinth, he didn't." I don't think Labyrinth did that at all. I think Labyrinth is what sent him back to TV. It was when he didn't quite stick the landing on television that's when he went, I'm trying to do too much at this point.
So rolling right into Disney, this was a bit of a painstaking process. His relationship with Disney was not always what you'd say on the friendliest terms. He was obviously a guy who was protective of his creations, but also, as you mentioned before, the people behind them. And that led to a lot of friction between him and the Disney company, throughout when negotiations and all the things that they were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, as Michael Frith put it, he said, we were this little company working out of a brownstone, and they were the Walt Disney Company. And he said they came in and audited everything. He said they were asking, "Where's the safety certificate for the elevator in here?" He said, just like every single detail mattered. And they were a company that was this, there's like, we were the hippies, and here came the suits to audit everything. And, there was kind of no joy in the process. But it was a process Jim wanted to work. He really wanted that relationship to work, partly because he had a really good relationship with Michael Eisner, who was sort of the new president at Disney. And Jim had a relationship with him going back to the early 70s. Eisner's the one who, as a young executive at ABC, said, I understand the Muppets. I'm going to green light a pilot for you. He's the one that greenlit the first 2 Muppet pilots, maybe the first 3, even. I've lost count. Really believed in Jim, and was really giving him a chance to get the Muppet show to stick. And it didn't happen at ABC. It ends up being with the CBS owned and operators in sort of syndication. But he had a really good relationship with Eisner, and I think was really hoping that the strength of that relationship would make that deal go through to both their satisfaction. I called that chapter on the Disney deal so much on a handshake. Because Jerry Joel, his head writer, just said Jim would just constantly say, my handshake, guys. Eisner and I shook hands. We're going to make this thing work. And one of his great frustrations was with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who went on to actually have a good career with the Muppets after Jim's passing. But at the time, Jim was very frustrated with him because he really thought that Katzenberg was making him justify his role in his own company, and was really nickel and diming it. So Jim, he doesn't have an agreement with Disney, but he's still doing projects for them. He's trying to develop rides. He's trying to develop his corner of the park there at MGM Studio. Well, whatever was it called? It wasn't MGM at the time. Doesn't matter. Disney Hollywood Studios. He's trying to develop his little corner of the park. He's doing Muppet 3D. God bless it. He's doing, the Muppet 3D without really an agreement. He just sort of is like, really hoping this is going to work out, really wants it to work out. And doesn't ever send it, but at one point writes this very, especially for Jim Henson, this very tight-lipped letter, saying like, if you're going to make me justify every single penny I spend, I'm not sure this is a relationship I want to be in on. But I think he really wanted to make it work. First of all, because I think what made it partly attractive was they were going to give him his own production company. That was one of his sort of non-negotiables, was he would have his own company inside Disney where he would be free to develop Labyrinth 2 or whatever else he wanted to do, his own sort of wide range of projects that maybe did or did not have the Muppets. There were a lot of people who also thought he would put a cap on the relationship where he would be exclusive to Disney for 10 years and then would walk away. And just leave the Muppets with Disney and with the performers, and he would just walk away and do other things, which I think very well might have happened. But he was also adamant, as I mentioned earlier, that they look out for those performers. They, having the puppets was just a toy box full of limp rags. You had to take care of those performers, and Jim was determined to make sure they took care of the performers and get them the deals they needed to get them in there. And to train performers. He tried to make them understand that puppetry is an art, and you really have to train these people to do this. This isn't something really easy. They were viewing the Muppets as an IP, which it certainly was, but it was also an art. You don't own Kermit in the same way you own Winnie the Pooh, for example. Other people can write and draw Winnie the Pooh. With the Muppets, it's something very different. It's something tangible, and it requires somebody else to be performing that character, which is, I think that was something very different for Disney. And ultimately, they didn't get the deal when Jim passed, but I think that sort of fraught relationship and negotiation with Disney and the Henson Company sort of showed Disney how not to do it, so that when they went out shopping for IPs later, they had a better idea of how to do it. I think that's one of the reasons that when they acquired something like, Marvel or Lucasfilm, you leave kind of, I don't want to just call them a figurehead, but you leave some of your creative personnel in place. You don't buy Marvel and fire everybody. You bring in Marvel and you hire Kevin Feige to be your guy who does your movies. You keep Kathleen Kennedy in there to oversee a lot of the Star Wars universe. So you can say what you like about whether you think Kathleen Kennedy does a great job. She's the one driving the bus in there and really has a good instinct for that side of the Lucasfilm business. So I think that they learned from their failure with the Jim Henson Company that when you acquire that IP, you need to get those creatives along with it. They weren't so sure when they were buying them up that they wanted those creatives. They just wanted the IP. Jim was determined to make sure they got those creatives. I think that really informed the way Disney negotiated with a lot of those other companies they acquired moving forward.
Now, obviously, Disney has the Muppets, and
Do not know what to do with
they're
them.
yeah, I was about to say, they seem to have a real problem with finding a home for them, not only in their parks, but in in the entertainment sphere. It seems like so much of what Disney wants to do is really formulaic at this point. And one of the things that I've always said is there's always with the Muppets a touch of chaos. They thrive in chaos, and
You and Jerry Joel.
and so it's one of those things where I feel like, and maybe this is getting to what you're saying a little bit with making sure that some of those creatives are there. They haven't been able to really, after all this time, wrap their arms around what the Muppets really are, and how to best use them.
Yeah, I think they want to know how to use them. I think they know that they've got a good IP. I think they know intellectual property people. I'm sorry, I didn't parse that.
Right.
I think they know they've got good performers working in there. The person running the Muppet Studios now, people speak very highly of. They had sort of changed personnel there, and apparently the new director or the overseer is somebody who kind of gets it. So I think there's hope in there. It was, right after the sort of change of the guard at the head of Muppet Studios. That's when you did get some things like Muppet Haunted Mansion. You got them starting to try to at least play around in the universe. Like I actually thought that the Electric Mayhem series was fabulous. And it's one of those things that, the Muppet Show in 1976, were you trying to make it today? It wouldn't have gone longer than a season. They would have canceled it. In the 70s, they gave them time. I think the problem you have nowadays is they don't give things time. You've got to be a smash hit immediately. They're not going to let it sort of sit and find its audience. That Netflix did the same thing to the Dark Crystal sequel. They're just not giving these things enough time. I think if you give them enough time, they're going to get there. You've got somebody like Bill Beretta working for one of the performers who's so funny. He does Pepe the Prawn is Bill. He does a lot of different sort of classic characters, but he's so funny. He's so quick on his feet, and I think they're starting to hand him the reins to some stuff a little more now. You had Kirk Thatcher doing things, who knew Jim and worked with Jim. So I think they want to do good things with the Muppets now, which I wasn't always convinced of that. And we'll see if they get there. I'm hearing rumblings now about is Seth Rogen developing a new Muppet Show. I don't know. But you're hearing the rumors on that now. I think partly they might be embarrassed that they've closed off the Muppet portion of the parks now, and they're like, no, we got this. There's Muppets coming back. But so maybe if that kickstarts a revived Muppet Show, which please don't mess that up if you do it. But there may be some hope yet in that. I do. There as you've probably seen, they're retheming the old Rock and Roller Coaster to be an Electric Mayhem ride there. So maybe you'll start seeing more and more Muppets showing up in Disney attractions and Disney rides. There's still great people performing the Muppets. I think there's hope out there. They've got to figure out the best way to right the ship. And I think part of it is they've got to give it time. You can't go 8 episodes and go, well, that was nice, and then just be done. I think it's going to take a little bit of time. It's a different kind of performing than a lot of other things. I think you've just got to give it time.
Yeah, I even thought that it was during COVID, the Muppets Now thing, like that was an interesting concept that they came up with there. So there are little nuggets, there are things that they do now and then that I think show some promise and show that they're willing to be a little bit think a little bit more outside the box with this than maybe they were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Muppets TV series that was kind of like The Office. Yeah. That was another one. I think had they let that keep running, I mean, this was when it was still in the hands of the prior regime over there. But that's when I think had they given it time, they were figuring that one out. Because what did they figure out? Oh, the characters are what matter. The relationships between the characters is what makes this matter. And those last 10 episodes of that, it started to get nuts. I think it was just starting to find its footing when they pulled the plug on it. I think had they let it go another season, they probably would have found the right combo on that one, but it just needed a slightly more time.
you were the one who kind of balked at the Dark Crystal. Me, I gave up on that show. Maybe too early. Maybe it's something I need to revisit, but I'll count myself among the guilty for that one.
Yeah, no, it's but see, I mean, it's one you got to stay with. Like Dark Crystal is one of those when you come back, when I came back to it later, better understanding. I was like, oh, I get it. I see you at the time, when you're 12 years old, nobody does moral outrage like a 13-year-old. So.
All right. So just one final question, and this is much more of a speculative question, but from what you know of Jim, and obviously he was someone who was into the way that things worked as much as anything else. Looking at today's entertainment and some of the things that they do now, what do you think is something that would fascinate him and something that he would really love to get his hands on if he was alive today?
So I think part of it, as I said before, it's a dangerous game when it comes to him. But nonetheless, I shall speculate. Michael Firth at one point said, talking about and this was 10 years ago with CGI tech, he said, I think Jim would be on cloud 900 to be able to play with the CGI that they've got nowadays. And part of what makes him Jim Henson is he wasn't George Lucas who's out developing the tech. Jim was the one you could hand him the tech and he'd figure out something really cool to do with it that you hadn't thought of before. That again seems very obvious. His ability to find creative solutions to problems hidden in plain sight. He was somebody who early on was basically came up with the concept of interactive video games, where he was like, you have to have a movie where everybody can, it was like a choose your own venture of a movie. And he was like, the audience will be asked to make a choice here. And based on that decision, another, real A or real B will spin in and will show the next part of the movie. And then they can make another choice. I mean, that's kind of what you're doing in a video game. Every choice you make prompts a different, response from the tech. Jim loved the way that tech worked. So, he was sort of anticipating the way the more complex video games worked out. He loved the Steadicam and the handheld camera, and he really loved the idea that there would be sort of a democratizing with a small d of tech, and that anybody could make a film with just a handheld camera. He loved that idea. George Lucas did too, actually, but Jim loved that idea of flattening the tech and making it accessible to everybody. Would he be able to come up with something ethical and cool to do with AI? I don't know. I mean, if anybody could, he probably could, and he would want to do it in a way that was fair to the artists and ethical AI. I think he would come up with maybe something that, again, he would come up with it, and we'd all go, "Oh, duh! Well, of course, that's the way you do that." But we haven't thought of it because we're not him. So that's what he really had a knack for doing, was figuring out something that already existed and saying, what if you used it this way? So I think he would take something like AI and, Flow on Google, where you can make these amazing, live action movies by typing 3 sentences in and you get what look like real people. But I think he would figure out something really cool you could do with that wouldn't rub us all the wrong way and, rip off, other creative people. So I think that's where you might see him going. It was just there's so many possibilities with tech now. You have to do it responsibly, but I think he would figure out a way to do it. What that would be, I can't answer that. But I think that's something like that would have fascinated him. He was always sort of right on the cutting edge of tech and just finding it all really fascinating. I mean, he, in one of the last, weeks of his life, he was, his son John talked about, he went to his apartment and Jim was running around with a Steadicam. He was just so impressed with Steadicam technology and collapsed while he's running around. And his son's like, you can't, when people are sick, they don't run around with Steadicams, but is running around with a Steadicam when he's very ill. So Jim just loved that tech.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me and giving us a little bit of a window into what you found in your research in putting this book together. For those who are interested in picking up the book, where can they find it? Where can they find more about you and the work that you do?
You can find out more at me at my website is Brian J. Jones, spell out J-A-Y, all one word. BrianJJones.com. That tends to be the handle I use on almost any social media. I'm primarily on Blue Sky now. I closed down Twitter a long time ago. I have a latent Facebook account that I'll probably open back up here again soon. But Blue Sky is where I tend to be running my mouth the most. Instagram, I'm over there as well. I'm very fortunate that all of my books are all still in print. So if you can't find them at your local bookstore, you can order them online from almost any online dealer. And I thank you for it.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing your next book coming out next year, and good luck with end the basically the ending of the editing process for that. I know that can be a grueling process in and of itself, and a little bit nerve wracking.
Yeah, fortunately I have a fantastic editor who this is like when I was writing about George Lucas, his wife Marcia was a film editor, and I always talked about how she had the ability to see a movie from the point of view of an audience, which sounds like it should be a no-brainer, but is actually really, really hard. And my editor at Dutton, her name's Jill Schwartzman. She's a fantastic editor who has the ability to read a book from the viewpoint of a reader. And will send me, not so much edits, but questions in the margins. Is there something missing here? I think it would be helpful to know a little more about XYZ. And every time I read that, I go, oh, God, of course she's right. So she's a fantastic editor. It's actually really fun to be edited by someone like that. So fortunately, the editing with her has never been a slog. I've been very fortunate to have awesome editors in that regard. So it can be a little bit of a brow beater because sometimes you have to go back and cut things, or you have to take 5 pages out and rewrite them as 2 paragraphs instead. That can be a challenge, but ultimately I have never had a time when I've had to do that. And I've never thought, oh God, this is the wrong decision. It's always been the right decision, especially when you're a windbag like me. So.
All right. Well, thank you once again for joining me. This was a blast. And I look forward to reading more from you.
Well, Chris, you're awesome. I love being with you and your listeners, and let's do it again.
All right.
But now let's get things started on the most sensational, inspirational, celebrational, motivational. This is what we call the Muppet Show.
Oh, Kermit, my love, when do I get to sing something?
Later, Piggy. I don't have time right now.
Kermit? Make time.
Well, thank you everybody for joining me on this episode of the Maza's Musings podcast. And thank you very much to Brian J. Jones for offering so much knowledge and insight into Jim Henson. As you can tell, he puts so much effort into the research into these books. You can tell that he really sinks his teeth into these subject material. And I'm just grateful that he took a little bit of time to share this with us. And the great part is this is one of his favorite subjects to talk about. And I love being able to give people those kinds of platforms to have another avenue through which they can share what they're passionate about. If that's something that you're interested in, you can connect with me through so many different ways. We have the Maza's Musings podcast on Facebook. We have Maza's Musings pod on hashtag, always Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. We're also on Blue Sky. We have a YouTube page, and we are also at Maza's Musings podcast on TikTok. You can also send an email, mazasmusings@gmail.com. And you can also connect by going to mazasmusings.wordpress.com, where you'll find contact information, more information about me and this podcast. You'll also find past episodes, and you'll also find how to subscribe to the newsletter. And the newsletter is something that comes once a week in your inbox that lets you know about what's coming up on the podcast, maybe things that you might have missed. And we'll also share other exciting information, like occasionally podcasts that we've found, sweepstakes and contests, and all other fun stuff. Basically, if we find it interesting, we want to share it with you, because we figure if you're getting the newsletter, you're probably going to find it interesting too. And one of the main goals of this podcast is to create a community where people are connecting with me and also ultimately, hopefully, connecting with each other. And the best way to help grow that community is by word of mouth. So if you are enjoying this podcast, please tell your friends and family. Another way that you can help us, though, is by giving us a rating or a review on your favorite podcatcher. Whether it's 5 stars or thumbs up, whatever it is, those help us in the algorithms that bump us up and make us more visible to more people. And if you want to bump up your support just even a little more, you can buy us a blue milk. And buying us a blue milk is basically a small, obligation-free way to help us with the small monetary costs that go into putting this podcast together. Whether you are a first-time listener or you're buying us blue milk or anywhere in between, we certainly appreciate all of the support. And as always, I hope you have a great weekend and a great week. Podcast is brought to you by Hi Dad Soup. Check them out at Mickey and Minutes on Instagram.